scarce moistened his heel. In going and coming through both hemispheres, they did all that lay in their power to discover whether or not the globe was inhabited. They stooped, they lay down, they groped in every corner, but their eyes and hands were not at all proportioned to the small beings that crawl upon this earth, and therefore they could not find the smallest reason to suspect that we and our fellow citizens of this globe had the honour to exist. The dwarf, who sometimes judged too hastily, concluded at once that there were no living creatures upon earth, and his chief reason was that he had seen nobody, but Micromegas, in a polite manner, made him sensible of the unjust conclusion. For, said he, with your diminutive eyes you cannot see certain stars of the 50th magnitude, which I easily perceive, and do you take it for granted that no such stars exist? But I have groped with great care, replied the dwarf. Then your sense of feeling must be bad, said the other. But this globe, said the dwarf, is ill contrived, and so irregular in its form as to be quite ridiculous. The whole together looks like a chaos. Do but observe these little rivulets. Not one of them runs in a straight line, and these ponds, which are neither round, square, nor oval, nor indeed of any regular figure, together with these little sharp pebbles, meaning the mountains, that roughen the whole surface of the globe, and have torn all the skin from my feet. Besides, pray take notice of the shape of the whole, how it flattens at the poles, and turns round the sun in an awkward oblique manner, so that the polar circles cannot possibly be cultivated. Truly, what makes me believe there is no inhabitant on this sphere is a full persuasion that no sensible being would live in such a disagreeable place. What then? Said Micromegas. Perhaps the beings that inhabit it come not under that denomination, but to all appearance it was not made for nothing. Everything here seems to you irregular, because you fetch all your comparisons from Jupiter or Saturn. Perhaps this is the very reason of that seeming confusion which you condemn. Have I not told you that in the course of my travels I have always met with variety? The Saturnian replied to all these arguments, and perhaps the dispute would have known no end if Micromegas, in the heat of the contest, had not luckily broken the string of his diamond necklace, so that the jewels fell to the ground. They consisted of pretty small unequal stones, the largest of which weighed 400 pounds, and the smallest 50. The dwarf, in helping to pick them up, perceived as they approached his eye that every single diamond was cut in such a manner as to answer the purpose of an excellent microscope. He therefore took up a small one, about 160 feet in diameter, and applied it to his eye, while Micromegas chose another of 2,500 feet. Though they were of excellent powers, the observers could perceive nothing by their assistance, so they were altered and adjusted. At length the inhabitant of Saturn discerned something almost imperceptible moving between two waves in the Baltic. This was no other than a whale, which in a dexterous manner he caught with his little finger, and placing it on the nail of his thumb, showed it to the Syrian, who laughed heartily at the excessive smallness peculiar to the inhabitants of this our globe. The Saturnians, by this time convinced that our world was inhabited, began to imagine we had no other animals than whales, and, being a mighty debater, he forthwith set about investigating the origin and motion of this small atom, curious to know whether it was furnished with ideas, judgment, and free will. Micromegas was very much perplexed upon this subject. He examined the animal with the most patient attention, and the result of his inquiry was that he could see no reason to believe a soul was lodged in such a body. The two travellers were actually inclined to think there was no such thing as mind in this our habitation, when, by the help of their microscope, they perceived something as large as a whale floating upon the surface of the sea. It is well known that at this period a flock of philosophers were upon their return from the polar circle, where they had been making observations, for which nobody has hitherto been the wiser. The gazettes record that their vessel ran ashore on the coast of Bothnia, and that they with great difficulty saved their lives. But in this world one can never dive to the bottom of things. For my own part, I will ingeniously recount the transaction just as it happened, without any addition of my own, and this is no small effort in a modern historian. Chapter 5. The Travellers capture a vessel. Micromegas stretched out his hand gently towards the place where the object appeared, and advanced 2 fingers, which he instantly pulled back, for fear of being disappointed. Then opening softly and shutting them all at once, he very dexterously seized the ship that had contained those gentlemen and placed it on his nail, avoiding too much pressure, which might have crushed the whole in pieces. "This," said the Saturnian dwarf, "is a creature very different from the former." Upon which the Syrian, placing the supposed animal in the hollow of his hand, the passengers and crew, who believed themselves thrown by a hurricane upon some rock, began to put themselves in motion. The sailors, having hoisted out some casks of wine, jumped after them into the hand of Micromegas. The mathematicians, having secured their quadrants, sectors, and Lapland servants, went overboard at a different place, and made such a bustle in their descent that the Syrian at length felt his fingers tickled by something that seemed to move. An iron bar chanced to penetrate about a foot deep into his forefinger, and from this prick he concluded that something had issued from the little animal he held in his hand. But at first he suspected nothing more, for the microscope, that scarce rendered a whale and a ship visible, had no effect upon an object so imperceptible as a man. I do not intend to shock the vanity of any person whatsoever, but here I am obliged to request people of importance to consider that, supposing the stature of a man to be about 5 feet, we mortals make just such a figure upon the earth as an animal the 60,000th part of a foot in height would exhibit upon a bowl 10 feet in circumference. When you reflect upon a being who could hold this whole earth in the palm of his hand, and is provided with organs proportional to those we possess, you will easily conceive that there must be a great variety of created substances. And pray, what must such beings think of those battles by which a conqueror gains a small village, to lose it again in the sequel? I do not at all doubt but if some captain of grenadiers should chance to read this work, he would add 2 large feet at least to the caps of his company. But I assure him his labour will be in vain, for, do what he will, he and his soldiers will never be other than infinitely diminutive and inconsiderable. What a wonderful address must have been inherent in our Syrian philosopher that enabled him to perceive these atoms of which we have been speaking. When Leeuwenhoek and Hartzoeker observed the first rudiments of which we are formed, they did not make such an astonishing discovery. What pleasure, therefore, was the portion of Micromegas in observing the motion of these little machines, in examining all their pranks, and following them in all their operations! With what joy did he put his microscope into his companion's hand, and with what transport did they both at once exclaim, "I can see them distinctly! Don't you see them, carrying burdens, lying down and rising up again?" So saying, their hands shook with eagerness to see and apprehension to lose such uncommon objects. The Saturnian, making a sudden transition from the most cautious distrust to the most excessive credulity, imagined he saw them engaged in their devotions, and cried aloud in astonishment. Nevertheless, he was deceived by appearances, a case too common, whether we do or do not make use of microscopes. Chapter 6. What happened in their intercourse with men. Micromegas, being a much better observer than the dwarf, perceived distinctly that those atoms spoke, and made the remark to his companion, who was so much ashamed of being mistaken in his first suggestion that he would not believe such a puny species could possibly communicate their ideas. For though he had the gift of tongues, as well as his companion, he could not hear those particles speak, and therefore supposed they had no language. Besides, how should such imperceptible beings have the organs of speech? And what in the name of Jove can they say to one another? In order to speak, they must have something like thought, and if they think, they must surely have something equivalent to a soul. Now, to attribute anything like a soul to such an insect species appears a mere absurdity. But just now, replied the Syrian, you believed they were engaged in devotional exercises. And do you think that this could be done without thinking, without using some sort of language, or at least some way of making themselves understood? Or do you suppose it is more difficult to advance an argument than to engage in physical exercise? For my own part, I look upon all faculties as alike mysterious. I will no longer venture to believe or deny, answered the dwarf.